Good morning, Goodwill. All right, it is great to be here. I am thrilled to be able to help open up your conference this morning. And let me start by telling you why I'm here. I'm here because, like you, I believe in the dignity of every individual. Like you, I believe that people ought to be able to have opportunities to fulfill their God-given potential. And like you, I believe that we need strong communities in order to reach our goals. I'm here because I want to talk to you this morning about the state of our nation and what it will take to create the kinds of communities that we want in this country. Now, some people tell us that we're stuck as a nation, that we're stymied, that we can't move forward, that this is as good as it's going to get, that there's so much acrimony and divisiveness that it is impossible to move ahead. You are at ground zero of that debate here in our lovely town of Washington, D.C., where that gridlock is at its greatest. But I'm here also this morning to tell you that we don't need to accept what the naysayers and the cynics and the skeptics say, that there is a path forward if we're willing to tap the courage that already exists within us and the wisdom that exists among us. Now, each of us, each of you, came to this work because of something deep within yourselves, something you had long before you were employed by a Goodwill, something that moves you, something that tells you that you can do good, that it's worth trying to make a difference in this world. Each of us has our own story. And this morning I'd like to tell you part of my story, in part so that you can know what motivates me as I stand here before you this morning, but even more importantly, that as I tell you part of my story, I hope that it will remind you of your own story, of your own story. You know, when I was young, I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. In the early 1960s, that was a death sentence. There was a point in time my doctors turned to my mother and said, "Face it, he's a lemon." No one expected me to make it this far, and I certainly never dreamed of having the opportunity of standing before you this morning. I lived much of my life in hospital beds, and I have vivid memories of doctors and specialists and nurses all encircling my bed, always talking to one another, but never talking to me. I travel for a living. I'm on the road 2 to 3 weeks a month. And every time I walk into a hotel room, it reminds me of a hospital room. It's only a few years ago that I stopped sleeping in all my clothes in those hotel rooms, and I didn't have to turn on every single light in that room so that I would feel safe and secure enough to be able to fall asleep. I had lost hope. I felt invisible. I didn't believe there was a way out. But I was lucky. Along the way, I met a coach who coached me in all my youth sports named Ray Rivers. I had a next-door neighbor named Jack Brendage and another guy named Jack Petker a few blocks down. And essentially, the community saved me. The community lifted me up to ensure that I would not fall through the cracks. That I would not fall through the cracks. That's my mom. Tell her I'll call in a few minutes. You're here because you have your own story. And this morning, I want to talk to that part of you. That part of you, tell her I'll call her in a few minutes. That part of you who believes that you can do good. That part of you who believes you can make a difference. That part of you who believes that if we lock arms and join hands, we can put our communities and this country on a different path. I want to talk to that part of you who believes in this country and in your communities that we can do better. That no child, that every child deserves a good education, regardless of the color of their skin, which side of town they're from, or what their economic station is in life. That we can do better and ensure that no American goes to bed hungry at night. And that we can do better and ensure that every individual willing and able to work can get a good job at decent wages with health care. We can do better in this country, and we must do better. And I want to talk to the part of you this morning who believes that that's possible. You know, much like I faced obstacles in my own life, we do face obstacles in this country. I spent the last year in preparing the book, The Work of Hope, crisscrossing this country, talking to Americans in large cities and small towns about their hopes, their dreams, their fears and concerns. And what I heard them say over and over again is that they believe we live in a Tower of Babel. In a Tower of Babel. Now, I didn't pull that line from the book of Genesis, and I didn't make it up myself. A number of people in different communities, as we talked, said that they believe we live in a Tower of Babel, where there is, in fact, too much acrimony and divisiveness, where we point fingers at each other and place blame at each other's feet for those things that we have not achieved and gotten done, where our debates, where we have too few leaders that we trust, and too many organizations who seem more interested in their own survival, in their own good, than they are in the common good, That we are too consumed with instant gratification in this Tower of Babel, of wanting what we want, when we want it, at the cost we want it. And if we don't like it, we get to return it. Sort of how we now talk about our public schools, right? In this Tower of Babel, what people told me is that it feels like a house of mirrors. I don't know, when you were a kid, I went to the county fair. I met some folks here from Maine, and we were talking about small towns. In my small town, I went to the county fair in upstate New York. And you remember when you went into a house of mirrors, and you believed you couldn't get out, but somehow you always knew that the guy who took your ticket, or a parent or some other adult, would come find you if you didn't come out soon enough. Remember that? And now what Americans are telling me in the house of mirrors they believe we're in, that they feel as though they're living their lives in. What they're telling me is wherever they run, the windows are slammed shut and the doors are locked, and they cannot find a way out from this Tower of Babel. What I've heard Americans say, that if we want to move forward as a country, we're going to need to get back to basics. And there are three things they mentioned real quickly. One is that we're going to need to ignite a new sense of compassion in our communities, a sense of compassion. And when they said this, they weren't talking about going to a website and sending $10 after a tragedy or a disaster, as important as that is. They weren't talking about text messaging $5 after something happens, as important as that is. They were talking about something much more important, something that goes to the heart of the work of Goodwill, that we are willing to see and hear every person in our community, that we are willing to walk in the shoes of other people, that we are willing to step forward and bring our whole selves to the challenges that we face in our communities and work together to solve those. Writing a check or clicking a box on the internet is nice, but it's not going to get us where we need to go. They said that we need more openness and humility in our communities and in our lives if we're going to find a new path forward. That so many of us have become so sure of what we think in this country, that we've got the right answer, that our team has the right answer, that our organization has the right answer. And we put our hands over our ears and eyes so that we don't have to hear anyone or see anyone, when in fact we need the openness and humility to recognize that we alone don't have the answers and that we alone can't solve the problems that we face. Because if we had had the answers, we would have solved these problems long ago. We can no longer go it on our own and be on our own, is what people are saying. We need to have more openness and humility in how we deal with one another. And they said that we need more concern for the common good. More concern for the common good, that we've become so concerned about ourselves and our own good, and that we're not concerned enough about the common good. You know, for 25 years, I've asked people questions in these conversations about the common good. And for 25 years, unfortunately, I'm here to tell you, as I ask people that question, their eyes glaze over, and they say that term sounds awfully abstract and academic. And in these conversations I did across the country in the last couple of years, I didn't bring up the phrase common good. The people in the conversations did. They said, for too long we've gone alone, we've been on our own, we've been worried about our own good, and it's high time, if we want to make progress in our communities in this country, that we're going to have to pay attention to our common good and not just our own good. It seems to me, if we want to find a new path forward in our communities in this country, there is one basic thing we will have to start with, one foundational thing we will have to think about, and that is we need to turn outward toward one another and turn outward toward our communities. For too long, we've been turned inward, focused on ourselves. Too many organizations, I don't know if this is true about some Goodwills, but what I find across the country is too many organizations are turned inward toward themselves, worried about their own survival, worried about protecting their turf, worried about getting enough credit. And when we believe that we're not effective and impactful enough, we decide that if we simply redo our strategic plan, that somehow that will make us more effective. If we adopt a new logo with a new color. Have you seen anyone do that? My organization adopted a new logo 2 years ago with a new color. And I hope to God it makes us more attractive. But I don't think it makes us a lick more effective. Not a lick. So often we believe that if we simply turn inward again and reorganize our staff and put people with new titles and new boxes and produce a nice PowerPoint presentation, that somehow that will make us more effective. I'm here to say that if, in fact, we want to take a new path forward, if we want to exercise more compassion and openness and humility and a concern for the common good, it's going to require us to turn outward toward our communities, where our reference point for getting things done is no longer our conference room, but the community itself, where we no longer believe that we're judged by the number of activities we have on our to-do list, but the number of effective actions that we take, where we no longer judge by the inputs, by what we're getting done, where we're no longer judged by our public relations, but by how well we're reflecting the reality of people's lives in our work. Now, I want to talk about 4 levers of turning outward that I think can help us get on a new path. 4 levers that I think are really important. And that I hope that as I speak here this morning, you'll think about how you can apply these both in this conference, in your cohort groups and other conversations that you have, and also as you go home. The first one is this. I believe if we want to take a new path forward, we need to know our communities much more deeply. Now, when I say that to people, they always tell me, well, I know my community really well. And as I probe them and ask more questions, what I find out is that they're making all sorts of assumptions about what people believe and feel and think in their community. That we have all sorts of preconceived notions about people and their dreams and their hopes and what they're trying to achieve. And when I probe them even more deeply, what I find is that when we do engage people, we often engage people who look like us and sound like us and talk like us. And oftentimes we're afraid to go into parts of communities that we're not familiar with or comfortable with, or we're not sure what people will tell us. What I find is I talk to people as we engage people, if we engage people, that we engage them around the problems that they face in their communities and in their lives. And what you know and what you see when we do that is that simply locks us into a debate once more about what's wrong, who's to blame, who didn't achieve what they needed to achieve. It takes us right back into the Tower of Babel. And when we're not talking and engaging people about the problems, we turn to visioning exercises. Have you ever done one of those with those little yellow dots? You ever done one of those visioning exercises? Where they tell us, don't talk too much, just go up to the room where we have a bunch of issues listed and put the yellow dot around those things that matter to you. But I ask you, if we're not having conversations with one another, if we're not listening to one another, how in God's name can we ever know what we believe together and where we want to move together? And if you've ever wondered why those visioning exercises often don't move anywhere in your communities, that they end up in the stacks of papers or in your filing cabinets or gathering dust on the shelf, It's because we're asking people to blue sky about something that's so untethered from their own reality that it doesn't hold any meaning or relevance for what they're doing. So I want to offer you an alternative for what we need to do if we're going to know our communities. And I want to do it in a way that offers a test that you can take. Now suppose this. Suppose I came into your community and I invited 200 people like we have here this morning into a room just like this. And suppose I asked you to come to the middle of that room and I asked you to stand on the table among all these 200 people. 200 people you do not know, but 200 people from your community nonetheless. And imagine if I asked you, as you stood up on that table, not to talk to people about your programs, not to tell them about your initiatives, not to tell them about all the metrics that you have or your new strategies, but instead I ask you to look into their eyes. And I ask you to reflect back to them their personal aspirations for their lives and their shared aspirations for their community. Could you do it? Could you do it? If I ask you to stand up on the table and reflect back to people the challenges that they're facing in their lives and the ways in which they talk about them, not the ways in which our budgets present them or our programs divvy them up or some report out of the Brookings Institution talks about them, but the ways in which people talk about them in their lives, the language that they use, the connections between and among issues that they make, the ways in which they have lived experiences around these challenges. Could you do it? Could you do it? The victory here is not being able to stand up on the table and pretend that we can do this. To me, that's defeat. The victory is when we say on part, yes, I can do it. Or the other victory is to be able to say, I cannot do it yet. But tomorrow's another day. And I can make sure I can start down the path of being able to do this tomorrow. That, to me, is the victory we need in our communities and this country. Number two. You still with me? Number two. We need to focus more on the conditions of our communities that enable change to come about. You know, so many people, when I work in communities, many of the communities that are here today, they ask me, why is it that we're not making more progress in our community? We're trying hard, we're running hard. And when we talk about it, they often say to me, if we only could create one more program, we would be able to achieve everything that we want. If we could announce one more initiative, we would be successful. If we could get more money or more technology, we would be more successful. And maybe we would be more successful. And now what they tell us is, if we could only come together and work together in something called collective impact. Have you heard that? The new fad that's going around, collective impact. This notion that if we align all our organizations in the community, if we coordinate everyone's activities, if we get us all focused in the same way, we will achieve our goals in our community. But I ask you this, what makes us think if we get the same old groups who are largely doing the same old things, we're going to produce a different result? I ask you that. And so I've said to my friends in Collective Impact, beware, beware, because this could become the next fad and the next false promise to our communities if we're not careful. What I believe we need to focus on if we really want to transform our communities is that we need to focus on the underlying conditions that enable those communities to work. And I just want to mention 3 of those conditions that the Institute has identified. We've identified 9. I want to talk about 3 today. The first one is we need an ethic of shared leadership in our communities. We need an ethic of where we believe we need to work together, where we need to come together as leaders, where we can no longer go it alone and be lone rangers. We're simply trying to protect our turf and get the most credit for our own organization is not the path forward. Where there needs to be a shared sense of ownership of the challenges that we face. We need to create those conditions in our community if we want to have any chance of being able to achieve our goals. We need to create more boundary-spanning, what I would call boundary-spanning organizations in our communities. And I believe Goodwill is one of those. organizations who can reach across dividing lines, organizations who can incubate new ideas and not simply hold on to them, but to spin them off to another group who may have stronger core competencies or abilities or capacities to actually implement the program. We need boundary-spanning organizations who have the courage and the bravery to hold up a mirror to our communities so that we can see our shared realities once and for all, and we can hear our shared aspirations so that maybe, just maybe, we can have a shot at creating the kinds of communities that we all aspire to have. And it seems to me we need a mindset and practices of innovation. Wherever I go across the country, people tell me we need to do more planning. And I'm here to say I love planning. I'm a big planner myself. But I don't believe we can plan our way out of the Tower of Babel. Because if we could, we would have done it by now. It seems to me we need a mindset of innovation, where we're willing to try things, and if we fail, we're willing to fail and learn from it and get back up and keep moving ahead. That we're willing to try to figure out what is the right pathway forward. And if we can't find that right pathway, we're willing to make mid-course corrections and go down a different path. We need a mindset of innovation if we're going to figure out how it is that we can work together and break the silos and fragmentation that now mar so many of our efforts in so many of our communities. Third, I want to talk about the difference between impact and belief. Now, so many of us are focused on impact, and I know Goodwill has done tremendous work on figuring out how to create impact and how to measure impact. And my own organization, the Kellogg Foundation, has invested lots of money in the Institute to figure out how we can demonstrate and measure our effectiveness to create impact in communities. But as you know, impact is demonstrated by numbers, by facts. Belief is something different. And if we want to create a new path forward, it seems to me we have to believe in ourselves that we can actually do it. That we can actually do it. I'm reminded of a story of a group I was talking to in the Work of Hope. We spent an hour and a half talking about the issues that this community, was Las Vegas, that this community faced. And after a while, they turned to me and they said, you know what we need to do in this community? We need to get together and we need to fix the school down the street. We need to clean it up and paint it. And other people in this conversation said, yeah, we need to bring people out of their homes and start to work together. As I looked at them, I was kind of incredulous. I said, you know, you just spent an hour and a half talking to me about all the problems you face in this community and the systemic challenges you face in education. Are you really telling me that if we go down the street and fix the school and paint it, that somehow that's going to deal with the systemic issues in this community? And they looked back at me and they said, Rich, you're not listening carefully enough. Rich, you don't get what we're after here. They said the reason why we want to go fix that school is because we don't trust one another to come out of our homes and work together. We don't believe that if we step forward, other people will come for us. We need to find a way in this community for those of us to come together and demonstrate that we have the capacity and the ability to set goals together. We need to demonstrate that if we fail and fall down in our efforts, we have the fortitude to stand back up and figure out how we need to move forward. What they said is, you're missing our point. This isn't simply about fixing the systemic issues in our community. It's about restoring our belief that we can come together and work together, that we can come out of our homes and make a difference together. They said to me, you know, Rich, we know that fixing a school will not fix our systemic issues in this community or in this country. But if we do not come together in our communities and do these small things together, we will never have the ability to fix the larger issues in our society. As I traveled across the country and listened to Americans talk about the issues that they face, and this was at the height of the Great Recession, they talked about the economy, they talked about rigged rules in our society, they talked about a whole lot of issues. But you know what the number one issue was that they told me we face as a country, as a people? that we need to restore our belief in ourselves that we can come together and get things done. The number one issue, they told me, in this country facing us. The number one issue. Fourth, we need to learn to tell stories in our communities that help us see a way forward. That help us see a way forward. You know, all of us live our lives by telling stories. No one ever comes to the dinner table with 3 bullets and says, let me tell you about my day. We come to the dinner table and say, let me tell you a story about what happened to me today. Right? Let me tell you a story about what happened to me today. What I've found is that communities tell stories too. They're often hidden from us. But what we found in our work is that the stories that we tell one another are the great hidden factor about whether communities move forward or not. And as you know, many of the stories we have about our own communities are stories about how we can't get things done, about how we tried something before and it won't work this time, about how people won't come out from their homes and work together. I was working in Youngstown, Ohio, and I want to tell you a quick story about Youngstown. The governor had taken over the schools not too long ago and set up an academic distress commission. The Academic Distress Commission asked me to come to the community and help them figure out what to do. The commission had the typical laundry list of reforms that they were going to show the community and say would fix their local public schools. And I said, before you get too far ahead of yourself, let's go out and talk to folks and see what they think about the schools in this community. And I want to tell you the story that people told me in Youngstown about the children in their community. They said, the kids in this community are incapable of learning. When I walk down the street and I see kids in this community walking towards me, I cross the street. That many of the kids in our community are up to no good, and they're likely to fall prey to crime and to perpetrate crime. That the kids in our community are not worth investing in. This is the story that people told me. I went and talked to a group of students, kids, about how they felt about themselves and education in their community. And you know what they said as I was talking to them? They said, let us tell you what we think the adults think of us. They think we're incapable of learning. They think when we walk down the street, we're going to do something to them, so they cross the street. They think that we're up to no good and that we're all about committing crimes. They don't believe in us. Now I ask you, if the narrative of a community is that, and that is a narrative of many communities, why in God's name do we believe that kids will be inspired to get up at 7 a.m. in the morning and catch the bus and go to school? Why do we believe that the parents and adults in that community, if that's the narrative that they're passing around to one another, will join together and fix the local school, will ensure that those kids don't fall through the cracks like the adults in my life, will ensure that we'll wrap our arms around those kids and make sure that there's an adult who loves them? Why do we believe that that will happen? We can implement the long laundry list of reforms that the Academic Distress Commission in Youngstown and in other communities have come up with. And I'm here to say, if we don't attack these underlying narratives in our community, those reforms won't amount to a hill of beans. We pass these stories to each other in our own communities. And so often when organizations hear what I say, they come up to me and they say, well, we've hired a consultant to help us do this. They're telling us all the good stories we should tell. And I ask them to pull up their websites when they ask me this, when they tell me this. And I know this is not true of Goodwill because I've seen many of your websites. But so often those stories, they're not about the community, they're about the organization. Another inward turn about how successful the organization has been, not about how the community has decided it needs to move forward. So there are two things I want to leave you with about the stories we need to tell each other if we're going to move forward. I believe we need to learn to tell stories of what I would call civic parables. Stories about communities moving forward. You know, all good parables, like the Good Samaritan, is a story about how someone set out on a journey, how they decided to move in a certain direction, how they encountered certain trials and tribulations. Maybe they fell down, and somehow or another they mustered up the courage to get back up and to take a new direction. These parables, they always tell us how people together achieve something. And if you ever noticed in good parables that the parables are always shareable, you don't need a consultant or a long story, that parables are short. You can share them with one another. And if you've ever noticed that each parable always has a moral insight for us, something that we can learn and take from it. And if you've ever noticed, all parables implicate the reader. The story of the Good Samaritan was not simply about what happened on that road. The story of the Good Samaritan is how each of us can be a Good Samaritan, about what each of us is compelled to do, about what each of our own obligations are. It seems to me we need to begin to tell those kinds of parables in our community so that we can share the stories and help see stories about how not our organization or a single individual moved forward, but about how those people in Las Vegas came together and decided to paint that school, how they set on a course, how they encountered challenges and got back up, and how other people can see that they too have the potential and the capacity to do what the folks did in that small neighborhood in Las Vegas. But we can't stop there. There's something else we need to do as well. We need to collect our stories and not simply inundate with people with them, which is what we do now in many communities. We need to collect those stories and connect the dots between and among them so people can see that there's actually a narrative happening. And as you know, all narratives happen over an arc of time. And these narratives give us a sense of hope and possibility when we see that as we're working against that narrative, for instance, in Youngstown, that people are starting to make a difference. And so what we need to help people see is what these stories add up to and how they're adding up to a new narrative in our community, a sense of where we came from, where we are, and the potential and hope for what we can achieve together. You know, there's an old country song, the refrain of which is, "I can't see me in your eyes anymore." I can't see me in your eyes anymore. I think what all of us want, what every American wants, is to be able to see themselves in our public life, to be able to hear themselves, to be able to believe that their lived experiences are reflected. And in order to do that, we're going to need to tell a different kind of story in our communities that enable us to move forward. So I just want to conclude with one last thought. A couple of months ago, I was called by the mayor of Newtown, Connecticut, to come up and lead the decision-making process about the future of Sandy Hook Elementary School. Every Friday for the last 2 months, I'd get on a plane and fly up to Newtown and lead 28 elected officials in public in trying to figure out how the community might move forward. And every Saturday morning at 6 a.m., I'd get a flight back to Washington so I could be home before my family got up on Saturday morning. The first Friday when I went to Newtown for a meeting with the mayor, I walked into Town Hall, and there was a sign to my left that read, "Our collective strength and resilience will be an example to the world." Our collective strength and resilience will be an example to the world. As I've worked with the people in Newtown, where 20 first graders were massacred, and 6 adults who were in that school that day were gunned down, what I have found in Newtown, as they've worked through this issue, is a deep, deep compassion for one another amid the most horrific circumstances. I have found a deep openness and humility to listen to one another, even though some families are hurting so badly. I have found a concern for the common good, even among those families who are victims or whose children had to watch these killings. I have seen a community choose, as they decided to raise the existing school and build a new school on that site. I have seen a community choose healing and hope over despair. It is one of the most remarkable sights I have seen in the 30 years that I've been doing this work. Our collective strength and resilience will be an example to the rest of the world. I believe in our communities, in your communities, that each of our communities, if we're willing to tap our collective strength, if we're willing to tap our collective resilience, that our communities can also be an example to the rest of the world. We don't need to wait for a massacre or a tragedy the size or scale of Newtown. We already know that we have people who want to move forward in their own lives. That's tragedy enough. And so what I say to you this morning, if we want to tap that collective strength, if we want to tap our collective resilience, we will need to take a new path forward. We will need to turn outward. We will need to bring ourselves together and understand our communities. We will need to focus on the underlying conditions that enable our communities to work. We will need to focus on not simply impact, but engendering a real sense of belief that we can get things done together. And we will need to tell a new story in our communities that help us show the way forward. And so I thank you this morning. I thank you for having me. I thank you for listening so early in the morning. But most of all, what I want you to know is that I stand before you this morning with a deep sense of gratitude for all the good work that you do and all the goodwill that you spread in your community and in this great country of ours. Thanks so much for having me.
Rich, thanks so much for setting a tone and for giving us a challenge and for inspiring us. We have a gift for you. This is a painting done, reflective of our work. It comes from our good colleagues in Orange County. Where's Orange County? There we are. Got one in the back of the room, a couple other folks around. Reflective of our work.
Great.
And an appreciation for your time with us this morning.
Thanks so much.
Thank you again.